Today we're going to look at section 7.0, which is about introductory to exponents. So today we are going to simplify exponents. Well, let's talk about what exponents are. If you can see, we have this x raised to the nth power. All right, so that's how I would read that. The x, which could represent a variable, it could be a number, we call that term the base. And that vocab word is very important. I'm going to be asking you what the base is a lot. So it's essentially the letter or the number that is the big term. And then what it is being raised to, that would be then considered your exponent. Okay, so those two vocab words are going to be seen a lot. We do need to know what the base is and what the exponent is. So now I want to look at this. It says, what is -3 in parentheses quantity squared? Well, what an exponent is it is going to tell you how many times you are going to be repeating the base. And when you repeat the base, you essentially are going to be multiplying them. So because this -3 is in parentheses, this entire thing right here, -3 in parentheses, that is my base. And so this 2, which now is my exponent, tells us that I need to take that base of -3 in parentheses and I need to write it out twice. So then when I multiply that, a -3 times a -3 is going to give us a +9. If I look then at this next question, it says, what is -3 squared? Notice this time there are no parentheses. And so we have to understand that in this case, only the 3 is going to be the base. So what I like to do is I like to rewrite this problem as like -1 times 3 squared. Okay, so because there were no parentheses, that negative has nothing to do with the base and the exponent. So if I wanted to write this out, I keep the -1, but then the base 3, because there's an exponent of 2, tells me that I want to write that base 2 times. If I was to multiply these together, -1 times 3 is going to give us -9. So as you can see, when we have parentheses, the negative is included. When we don't have parentheses, the negative is kept off to the side. And notice how I have two different answers here, and that's because the problems are different. So it's going to be very important that we understand when do I keep the negative in my process of multiplying that base and when do I not. So that's going to bring us to this, okay? What we essentially just did was called repeated multiplication. The exponent tells us how many times we repeat the base, so then we can multiply them together. So notice that in this top example, 5 to the third power, 5 is the base, 3 is the exponent. So that means I want to repeat that base of 5 3 times. So 5 times 5 times 5 is that repeated multiplication. If I then ask for a simplified form, well, now we can take our calculator and we can multiply 5 times 5 times 5. In your calculator, that turns out to be 125. So that's my simplified form. If I look at the next one, we have negative and then 5 to the third power. But notice that there are no parentheses. So I need to think of this as -1 times 5 to the third power. So when I'm thinking about writing my repeated multiplication, I keep the -1, and then I notice that it's just the 5 that is the base. So it's essentially now just like the first problem we did in this table. It would then be 5 times 5 times 5. So that is my repeated multiplication. So now if I was to multiply all those numbers together, -1 times 5 times 5 times 5, you would see in your calculator that you get -125. In this next example, notice that there are parentheses around this -5. So that means the entire base is -5. So because the exponent is a 2, I want to write that out 2 times. So my repeated multiplication is -5 times -5. Notice I have parentheses around those numbers. So now if I actually wanted to simplify it and get a number, well, negative 5 times negative 5 would give us positive 25. Notice that in this next one, we have no parentheses, so we do have to think of it as, okay, well, this is negative 1 times 5 being squared. So if I wanted to write out my repeated multiplication, it would be negative 1, and then my base was 5, which needs to be repeated 2 times, because that's what my exponent is. So now that I have my repeated multiplication, I can write what my simplified value would be. So negative 1 times 5 gives us negative 25. So notice that sometimes we'll get positive numbers and sometimes we'll get negative numbers. It really depends on, is the negative included or is it not included? So being aware of that is very important. In these next examples here, it says to express an exponential form, which means that right now it's in repeated multiplication form. So notice how I see the same number 3 times. So that means that I want 6 to be the base, and since I see it 3 times, 3 is my exponent. So 6 to the third power would be my exponential form. If I look at the next example, notice that I see the number 2 repeated 3 times, and then I see a negative 1 off to the side. So what I would want to do then is I would kind of want to think about it like what I have highlighted up here. The negative has nothing to do with what is actually the base with the exponent. So I want the negative, and then I'll want 2 to be raised to the third power because there's 3 of them. And notice that there are no parentheses because that negative is not repeated each time with the 2. In this last one here, I just see a number 1 time. Well, that means that 19 is the base and your exponent is just a 1. In these last few problems, it says to identify the base of each power. So once again, this is something that you're going to have to be very aware of. The base is what is connected to the exponent. So in part A, hopefully we notice that it's 12 that is the base because 5 is the exponent. In part B, notice that there are parentheses around the negative 2. So negative 2 in parentheses, that is my base. If you don't have the parentheses, you do not have the right answer. So parentheses matter. In the next one, notice that there's a negative, and then I see a negative 5 in parentheses. This outside negative has nothing to do with the base. But just like that second problem, the negative 5 that's in parentheses is the base. So I would write negative 5 in parentheses. That is my base. Okay, so hopefully you were able to understand in this lesson what a base is, what an exponent is, and how we can write things out in repeated multiplication.